Yeah, I'm Paul Nowak, I'm the General-Secretary of the TUC.
And then could you just tell me what we're doing here today?
Well, today we're calling on the British public to show their support for our campaign to protect the right to strike, but also to show their support for our public services and, crucially, the tens of thousands of public sector workers who are taking strike action today for a decent pay rise. So, events up and down the country, picket lines in cities and towns right across Britain, and I think hopefully sending a very clear message to the government that they need to deliver on public sector pay.
The government say that their anti-strike legislation is just to provide minimum services so the country can keep moving. What is it about it that you have particular aversion to?
I mean, the government is playing fast and loose with the truth. I mean, let's be clear about what the legislation means. It means that someone could vote for industrial action, go through a lawful industrial action ballot. Their employer then could tell them that they have to work, and if they don't, they could be sacked. And I think that's absolutely reprehensible, and I think the British public will find that reprehensible as well. So this is the government. It's a spiteful piece of legislation. Rather than listening to the concerns of hundreds of thousands of public sector workers, why those workers have taken industrial action, quite often for the first time ever, the government just decided to make it harder for people to take that action in the first place. And I think the British public will see through what they're trying to do, see through their attempt to drive wedges between different groups of working people.
The TUC is huge. It's an umbrella organisation. You've got about 5.5 million people who you're affiliated with. But what would you say to the people who aren't in a union? How would you explain strike action to them?
Well, this is about people coming together, standing up for what's right and standing up for a decent pay rise. And actually, it doesn't matter whether you work in an Amazon warehouse, and we saw Amazon workers taking strike action for the first time last week, or you work in a hospital, you work in a school. Sometimes you have to say enough is enough, and another real terms pay cut is just unaffordable for millions of working people. If people aren't in a union, I'd urge them to join a union. The best way to get your employer to listen to you, the best way to get in decent pay, a voice at work, is joining a union and being active in that union.
A tabloid interpretation of today might be that someone on a 0 hours contract can't get the rail today, so they can't go to work. I mean, what would you say to those people who've lost out on a day of pay?
Well, I mean, it's nobody likes strikes. Nobody likes the inconvenience that strikes bring. And I have to say that there isn't any public sector worker or indeed rail worker on strike today that wants to be on strike. I mean, those workers are losing pay. They're not delivering the services that they're proud to deliver. But we've got a crisis in our public services. It doesn't matter whether you're getting a train or a bus, whether you're applying for a passport, waiting for a GP appointment. There's a crisis in our public services, and imposing real terms cuts on the workers delivering those services isn't going to help one jot. So the government needs to take responsibility for this. From our railways to our hospitals to our schools, deliver fair pay, listen to your own workforce and listen to the British public.
So you wouldn't say that we have to keep public sector pay down to prevent inflation? I mean, who would you say was the root of the cause of all problems at the moment?
I mean, the reality is there is no evidence at all that it's the pay of paramedics or physiotherapists or teachers that's driving inflation in this country. And in fact, it's exactly the opposite, because it's the pay of those workers, the pay of workers right across the public services, that also supports our local economies. It's people who go and spend money in local shops, in bars, in restaurants. We are all in this together. The only people who aren't is a cabinet full of millionaires who don't have that real lived experience. And so actually I think that I would hope that public and private sector workers would recognise it's in all of our interests to get pay rises, all of our interests to fight against real terms pay cuts, and hopefully today is sending a strong message along those lines.
It's about 500,000 people on strike today. You have the authority to coordinate a general strike. I mean, how close do you think we are to that?
My job at the TUC is not to try and talk up grand gestures like the general strike. My job is to support union members who take the difficult decision to take industrial action. Those decisions aren't taken by me. They're not taken even by union leaders. They're taken by hundreds of thousands of ordinary working people in workplaces up and down the country. And my job, my responsibility is, when workers do take that action, is to support them as best we can and to make sure that action has as much impact as possible. I want the voices of working people, public and private sector, to be heard by this government, to be heard by employers. And the way to do that is not to talk up the grand gesture, deliver practically for unions and for their members.
We spoke to a teacher this morning who said she wasn't able to go on strike because she physically can't afford to. She can't afford to lose a day of pay. How does it make you feel knowing that some people physically can't afford to do this?
I mean, it makes me profoundly depressed that we've got millions of hard-working public servants who are struggling to get by day in, day out. I mean, a quarter of our hospitals now have food banks for their own staff. 46,000 civil servants in the DWP and HMRC are claiming the benefits that they administer through the tax credit system. Something has gone wrong where working in our public services just doesn't pay for far too many working people. So, as I say, I think we've got a responsibility, public and private sector, to come together to raise our voices for a decent pay rise for everybody.
I mean, Gillian Keegan this morning, the Education Secretary, said that she had offered teachers a decent pay rise. She said that some teachers were getting, nearly 8%. I mean, do you think there's maybe an argument that the government are sort of just trying to wait it out until inflation, or they perhaps can bring inflation down? Do you think this is kind of a waiting game?
Well, if it's a waiting game, I think they've made a huge mistake, because the reality is our members can't afford to wait. They can't afford promises of jam tomorrow. They need a pay rise right here, right now. Our bills are going up. The cost of filling up your car is going up. The supermarket shop is going up. The only thing that isn't going up is people's wages, and the government has to take some responsibility for that. Get round the table and negotiate a fair pay rise for our public sector workers.
Do you think in negotiations there would perhaps be a clause you would accept, which was when inflation came down, pay would come back down with it if 10% were to be granted?
No, because the reality is this pay squeeze has not been 1 year in the making or 2 years in the making. It's been more than a decade in the making. I mean, the average public sector worker is around about £200 a month worse off than they were in 2008 in real terms. So we need a long-term fix on pay, and we need to get the pay of our public servants rising again. And as I said, there's no evidence at all that it's the pay of our members that's driving inflation. It's this government and its failure to invest in public services, failure to invest in public sector pay, that's the root cause of all of these problems.
Are you disappointed that Labour aren't on the picket this morning?
Now, the key job, I think, for the Labour Party is not to be stood on picket lines having selfies with union members. It's to provide an effective opposition to the government. And crucially, when it comes to protecting the right to strike, Labour have opposed it in Parliament and made it clear the next Labour government will repeal that legislation and the 2016 Anti-Trade Union Act. That's what we need Labour to do, to show that strong leadership, to oppose these proposals in Parliament, and I'm pleased that they're doing it.
And Keir's the man to do that?
Well, he's the leader of the Labour Party, and at the moment, what's the job of the Labour Party? Two things. First of all, to provide an effective opposition, and the polls would suggest that Labour are doing that right now. But to go into that next election, whenever it is, on a manifesto that speaks to the concerns of working people, their families and communities. And I think we're heading in the right direction there. Are we going to agree with Keir and the front bench on every single issue? Obviously not. But a ban on 0 hours contracts, a ban on fire and rehire, union access to workplaces, fair pay agreements and social care, that looks like the beginning of a real step forward for working people in this country.